Okay, we're going to be looking at the Baroque period, and this is week 4 of your humanities class. All right. So we begin with one of the Italian artists that's perhaps the greatest 17th century sculptor and architect, and really was the creator of the Baroque style of sculpture and architecture, which is epitomized by movement, color, flamboyancy, perhaps is a good description of the Baroque style. And this is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. His most, oops, let me back it up for a second. His most famous sculpture is this one here. This is David. And you'll notice, look at how much movement, the way that the muscles curve, and David's body's curved, and he pulls back on his slingshot. So all of this movement is so common with the Baroque period, and we'll compare that later with another famous David. So the Baroque style, and Bernini really captured it when he redid St. Peter's. And we're talking about St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And you can see here the Baroque style is over the top. You've got undulating columns. Look at all this movement here. And an altar canopy, which is also known as a balcino. And it really is a counterpoint to so much of what we saw in the more classical times, like with Michelangelo. So again, lots of color, lots of movement, lots of gold. So this era again was characterized by a love of extravagance and monumental beauty. There's a tension between simplicity and embellishment. So you'll often see commoners and peasantry depicted along with this kind of elaborate embellishment. We also see in this time period the beginning of the conflict between science and faith, which characterizes much of the 17th century and pretty much every other century after. So while Baroque kings and popes built palaces and collected art, a new science was mastering the mysteries of the cosmos and reshaping Western culture and reshaping worldviews. This dynamic era, which is between 1600 and 1700, was the time when modern science and modern government was born. And it certainly had one of the greatest impacts on our present day. So this is the point of the Counter-Reformation. So we had the rise of the Catholic Church, and then we had the Reformation, which kind of took the Catholic Church down a notch. And now the Catholic Church is coming back up. So this is the Catholic Church weathering the storm of Protestantism during the Reformation and kind of celebrating its victory. It survived and thrived. And with it came an explosion of art and architecture. And extravagant color and design. Because remember, the Reformation was a lot about being humble and taking a step back. And Puritanism and Calvinism was functioning to kind of bring more of a subdued look. And this is best characterized by the two Davids. So we have Michelangelo's David here. Look at the stillness of David. He's pretty just upright. He doesn't have a lot of movement, a lot of life. But then look at Bernini's David. Look at the twisting of it. Look at the grimace on his face versus the bland face of Michelangelo's David. Not to say one's better than the other, but one is more active and more gives you a greater sense of movement than the other. So Bernini, aside from David, he also created another masterpiece. Well, he created a lot, but one of his other major masterpieces was the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, which it should be depicts. Sorry, the saint's ecstatic union with God. Basically, it's based on a story in which Saint Teresa claimed that she had a vision of an angel, and in his hands I saw a great golden spear, and the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. He then plunged it into my heart several times so that it penetrated my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt that he took them with it and left me entirely assumed by the love of God. The pain was so severe that it made me under several moments. The sweetness caused by this pain was so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease, nor is one's soul in content with anything but God. So this becomes this theme throughout the century of the idea that God has to destroy utterly destroy his worshipers, that he has to basically, for want of a better term, rape them. And you see that later in some of the other poets, particularly John Donne. But this idea of God ravishing the worshiper. And there's a lot of sexualized language and imagery here. But as you can see, again, lots of movement, lots of folding of cloths, lots of just angular bits that give the sense of realism. So St. Peter's Basilica, which still exists here in Rome, was one of Bernini's greatest undertakings, and certainly, again, the epitome of the Baroque time period. The key thing to remember here is the public square in front of the basilica. Now the Pope was receiving and giving blessings to an audience and had to have a large reception. So Bernini created this piazza, which kind of, in its trapezoid or forecourt here, looks like it's the embrace, the arms of an embrace, kind of embracing, see the embrace here, of the worshipers. So there's kind of this sense that there's more of a connection with God. I have here on this thing a clip for you where you can see a three-dimensional view of this great place and all of its wonderful decorations. Michael Caravaggio was another one of the Baroque artists, and one of the things he was most famous for is his depiction of light and dark. And he also kind of would have this this opposing items in his work, whether it's lightness versus darkness, or nobility versus peasantry, or the present time versus the biblical. So there was this kind of dichotomy here. He liked to depict, it should be depict. Sorry, my typing's not the world's greatest. Depict his biblical characters as Italian peasants who were not the idolized conventional treatment of biblical characters at the time, and caused it should be thus caused to have caused him to have some difficulty with his patrons. Sorry about my typing. I was a little rushed this week. So the Calling of St. Matthew depicted a rude tavern, much like Caravaggio's, frequented in his brief and turbulent life. So on the left of the picture, you'll see Matthew. So on the left of the picture, you see Matthew and the tax collectors. And then on the right, you see this light coming in. So here's Matthew and the tax collectors. and you see this light bringing your eye into them, but also the light is above and kind of shining on Christ, which you see right here, who's calling Matthew. And in the humble room steps Christ himself. Accompanied by St. Peter, Christ calls Matthew to leave the dark world of sin. The call is not issued by Christ's shadow's face, but the warm shaft of light that flows from an unseen window. Even the despised tax collector can be lifted from darkness by, it should be sin and darkness, by the sunlight of God's grace. Caravaggio's techniques embodies the spirit of Baroque religiosity. And one of the key things to remember is his dramatic use of this effect called chiaroscuro, which is this light and shadow that influenced so many of the artists. The light and then the darkness over here. Another innovative follow of Caravaggio was the artist Artissima Gentilsky, which I apologize for killing names, but my pronunciation's not the greatest. It's up there with my typing. Whose life demonstrates the challenge of being a female artist in Europe in the 17th century. She was sexually abused by her teacher, who her father had hired to train her, and she did not, though, stay quiet about it. She actually accused him, and there was a scandalous rape trial. She eventually did resume her career, and she kind of liked to adopt Caravaggio's techniques of light and darkness. And some of her favorite themes was Judith and Holofernes, which is a Hebrew legend widely illustrated in Renaissance and Baroque art. Holofernes was a commander of an attacking Syrian army. And you can see the brilliant foreground lighting pushing the action towards the viewer, creating this sense of horror and violence as Judith kills him. The other great art form that came out of this time, aside from the painting and architecture, was opera, Baroque opera. That was one of the greatest inventions of that era, certainly from Italy. It was stage drama set to music with virtuoso singers, orchestra accompaniment, and often very elaborate staging. It grew from some of the musical roots of the Renaissance, and it kind of allowed the Italians to adapt lyricism to the madrigal and to dramatic poetry. A group of humanists called the Camerata tried to recreate Greek tragedy, and that was part of the way that opera began as well, was kind of devising a style of solo singing that was set to tragic poetry. The first operatic synthesis of these elements came from the pen of Claudio Monteverdi, the court of Mantua. Monteverdi produced the first operatic masterpiece, Orfeo, and that was the dramatization of the myth of Orpheus's journey to the underworld in hopes of recovering his beloved Eurydice. So I have a picture of a video here. If you wish to see some of it, you just click on that. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So that's mostly the lyricism. It's not staged. Oops, sorry about that. But it certainly is one of the better versions of the singing. And you can hear the madrigal style that helped the madrigal, if you remember from last week, that musical style. You can hear that in the background. And then he kind of used that to paint and dramatize the inner emotional state of his characters. He uses chordal dissonances, which is when tones kind of make you feel discomfort, for emotional effect. Many believe his work can bring audiences to tears. During this time, you see this kind of opera being played with, and we really see two different types. We see it mature into two types: opera seria and opera buffa. Opera seria is based on lofty mythical themes. It's kind of like drama in the art, while opera buffa is comical opera with broad appeal to this kind of urban middle class. You see theaters kind of put to both of them. And I have two examples for you. This is opera seria. You can see more of the elaborate costumes here. I'm going to go ahead. See the elaborate costumes. They usually represent mythical characters. Whoops. And then we have the other one. Oops, sorry. Mythical character, sorry. I think I kind of got them mixed up. Okay, this is opera buffa. This is the one that's comedy. You can see kind of more comic elements. Peasantry. And then we have the other one, the opera seria. You can see much more kind of elaborate stage direction. You can see more characters and so on. So one's a simpler, the opera buffa is more of a kind of a comedy and is staged usually with less stuff, less machinery, and opera seria is much more dramatic. All right, so Vivaldi and the Italian Baroque music. So we start off, before we get to Vivaldi, we see the Venetians start to move here and start to get some prestige as Venice has become richer and more culturally extravagant. Barbara Strozia is the first European composer, a female at that, to kind of really make money off of her work. She didn't perform in public, but she kind of did it in conservatories and homes and schools, and was able to still make a good living writing music and playing in a small audience. But then we have the most famous of the Baroque composers from Italy, which is Antonio Vivaldi. And of course he's most famous for his work, The Four Seasons. He was a master of the Baroque concerto, which is a musical form in which a small group of instruments play in a concert with a larger orchestra. His most famous work, of course, was The Four Seasons, which, based on its title, is a suite of four concerts, which are still widely performed today. The first, La Primavera, is spring, and has three movements with alternating tempos: fast, slow, fast. And in the first movement of spring, violins dramatize the arrival of spring, its bird songs, murmuring streams, and sudden thunderstorm. These dramatic episodes are connected by a recurring melody called a ritornello, something that returns, ritornello, which provides an explicit regularity to the composition. Within this somewhat rigid structure, Vivaldi achieves brilliant variations and embellishments. Music publishers disseminate Vivaldi's music to all corners of Europe, and it was studied by Johann Sebastian Bach and other masters of the later Baroque period, and you can hear their influence. Here is Vivaldi's influence on them. play a, okay. All right, so that won't open, but I will fix that link and get you one that will open. So shaped by two main forces, we have the Catholic Counter-Reformation and absolutism shaping Spain, which is flush with money and riches from the New World. It's ruled by Habsburg dynasty, which reigned from 1506 to 1700 and featured Kings Philip II as its greatest monarchs and Philip IV. These monarchs patronized major architectural achievements and the so-called Golden Age of Spanish art and literature. And its two great geniuses were the painter Velázquez and the author Cervantes. So, Baroque architecture. King Philip II had kind of a stark palace built. As you can see, there isn't much as fancy as the French or some of the Italian architecture. The building functioned simultaneously as a palace for the king and a tomb for the king's father and a monastery dedicated to the patron saint, St. Lawrence. The entire scheme was borrowed from the vigorous classicism of Michelangelo's design on St. Peter, which you should be able to see right here. 3 generations of Spanish royalty decorated the galleries, so the walls inside are filled with great splendor. And we can see this style, particularly here, used in missionaries and governorship buildings in the New World, which kind of asserted the authority of Christian culture and promoted the inhabitants to conversion. So you can see, if you look at here, some of this reflected in particularly the Spanish areas like Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Peru. In fact, what is now modern Peru, the Inca capital of Cusco, and was built upon it the Jesuit church of La Compañía. The church was a distinctive facade containing stacked arches with unifying trifold work, clover-lay arch, and curving entablature. In Mexico City, the great cathedral of Mexico contains fantastically elaborate interior decoration. Its placement was on the site of an Aztec temple of the sun. Nothing stated so boldly that Christian colonialism had triumphed over that period. The greatest painter of that time was Diego Velázquez. He was a court painter to Philip IV from 1623 until he died. As a painter, Velázquez achieved a vibrant realism with his daring brushwork. As a courtier, he relentlessly pursued social and intellectual status for himself and his profession in an aristocratic culture that disdained artisans. His best work was The Triumph of Bacchus, which illustrated the scholarly belief that pagan mythology reflected historical fact or popular custom. Leering peasants crowd the painting at the right, while a pudgy Bacchus turns his eyes doubtfully aside from his rowdy, sunburned entourage. As with all subjects, Velázquez charged his gods and goddesses with psychological complexity. So you can see interesting hat here for some of these gods, and you can kind of see the peasantry over here, Bacchus's entourage over here. So we see color in skin tone. Velázquez creates dramatic contrast between the rough commoners, see the ruddy skin, see the pure white skin of the boys of the god of wine. Even as painter to the royal court, Velasquez was always a close observer of different social types and classes. La Meninas. Historians had identified the figure of 5-year-old Princess Margarita in her dazzling costume, her attendants, a pair of dwarfs, which was common at the time, and the artist standing before the canvas, the size of La Meninas itself. Reflected in the mirror at the rear. Here's the, sorry about that. Here's the reflection. And who may be sitting for their portrait. Just as possible, they could be visiting the painter and thus honoring him in his studio. Velasquez deepened these ambiguities with the figure of the courtier who has opened a door and gazes back at the scene. The composition of La Mina is apparently accidental, yet it attains a nuance and complexity of composition that appealed to the sophisticated patrons of the Baroque era. So again, we have the door here being opened, we have the painter being reflected. There's our painter. There's the reflection. There's the Princess Margarita. There's her attendants, including the dwarfs. Dog. Very interesting, busy piece, but reflects much of the time period. All right, now we go from art to books. Cervantes, the master of illusion. The idealistic knight Don Quixote de la Mancha constantly confuses the real world with his chivalric fantasy. Yet he draws others into his idealized world and ennobles them. As much as Velasquez's palpable realism draws the viewer into his illusionary painter studio, the author Don Quixote, who was Miguel de Cervantes, an impoverished veteran of foreign wars, slavery, and even debtor's prison, desperate to overcome poverty for his own prosaic world, Cervantes created one of the great utopian heroes of Western literature. The hero Cervantes' tale begins with an impoverished Spanish nobleman who spent too many hours in his library reading chivalric romances. Inspired to become a wandering knight, Quixote dresses himself in a ludicrous suit of armor and gains the services of a squire, Sancho Panza. Together, this unlikely Together, this unlikely pair sally forth on a series of adventures. Don Quixote, the gaunt and aristocratic knight, becomes so enamored of romantic fantasies that in his eyes a windmill is a giant and a rude tavern is a castle. Sancho Panza, the coarse peasant, is a realist who marvels at Quixote's delusions. The two extremes of realism and idealism illuminate one another and highlight the limitations of each of these attitudes. So we have the knight that dreams is the ultimate dreamer, and his best friend, compatriot, sidekick, who's the realist. And a little bit of the kind of they feed off each other in comedy. We have the straight man and the sidekick. So the novel was first published in 1605, and it was popular enough to inspire a plagiarized sequel by an anonymous author. Cervantes responded by writing his own part 2, in which Quixote's adventures continue, and the philosophical complexity of the novel increases. Quixote and Sancho are now famous for their exploits in Part 1 and meet characters who seek to manipulate and deceive the hero. In one telling episode, the hero of Quixote dresses himself as a knight of mirrors, so that when they duel, Quixote is doing battle with his own reflected image. It's a duel that Velasquez might have liked to sketch, since he liked using mirrors. Quixote finally is able to sustain his illusion, and his quest ends with a poignant scene, as Quixote, defeated and dying, relinquishes his chivalric ambitions. It's Sancho Panza who urges him to revive his fantasies. To live in a disenchanted world is, as Sancho says, to die in the hands of melancholy. And this kind of brings us to absolutism, the last point of the slide. This is this political power started by Hobbes's book Leviathan, in which Hobbes kind of gives us a defeatist idea of tyranny. And it's this idea that humanity is so bad, it's greedy and unruly, that you have to have a strong king in order to have order in society. And Hobbes's pessimism in his ideas lead to this idea of an absolutist state and kind of the efficiency of a monarch, particularly a monarch that's good. And according to the famous motto attributed to Louis the 14th, I am the state. The personal homage to the king is an act of patriotism. Indeed, many features of the modern political life now associated with republican democracies first rose under the absolutism of the 17th century, which led to a rebellion that we'll see later on next week. All right, enjoy.